Beautiful.
All right, right on, Joe. Much appreciated for you coming on the podcast. Like we were just talking offline, I wanted to have someone on who is cool. They're down to earth, but also is going to have some really good educational content and just going to keep it light but interesting for the audience. So just to get us kicked off, do you want to give us kind of some basic background on you? Maybe where you grew up, kind of what you've been up to in the past few years, or really whatever you want to get into that defines your background.
Yeah, totally, man. Thanks for having me on, Levi, man. I hope I can live up to the lofty standards of being cool because
You do, man.
but I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, a Midwest kid, and I really got I should say, the motivation for my career choice, which is ultimately in strength and conditioning and broadly human performance by being a lifelong athlete. So I was the son of a football coach. My dad coached for a local high school here called Moeller High School. It's one of those private Catholic schools. It's kind of a powerhouse in sports and academics. And kind of growing up with the expectation of kind of, playing football, playing sports and underneath a coach's son, I kind of always wanted to be involved in athletics. And when I got to college, I was kind of trying to figure out what to do while I was there. I had a really impactful strength and conditioning coach at UT Martin underneath our football program. Felt like that was something that really spoke to me. I was really curious about how I could I was a late bloomer as an athlete, unfortunately and fortunately for me, because I always joke around, if I would have actually hit a growth spurt before I got to college, I probably would have played a real position in football other than punter. So, I probably, and as a result, I might not have played at the same level of football realistically, which was a 1AA program. It was a fantastic experience, but I was always curious, after kind of, just hitting a big growth spurt and I call it like kind of an athletic spurt, early on in my college career where I was like slow my whole life. And then all of a sudden I was actually like running fast. Like, where the heck did this come from? Of how I could expand upon my own human potential. And further down the road, kind of as I was figuring out what career to go into, how I could do that with athletes around me, because there seemed to just be so much potential in the athletes around us. And there's kind of like if you're a collegiate athlete, there's almost a breakthrough moment where you physically or mentally just kind of adapt to the speed of the game and the difference of the game kind of at the next level. And was fortunate after getting out of college to land an internship at a really, at the time, a powerhouse in athlete development called Athletes Performance. They're currently known as Exos. And so got to work with some pretty top-notch coaches and athletes there. We were attached to the James Andrews Institute. We were doing a lot of education and training with the soft community as well. So it was just a fantastic experience and a great springboard for the rest of my career. I would later go on to be a business owner here locally in Cincinnati with a business that we did kind of just, we're a local fitness center. We did general fitness classes, personal training, but we were very veteran centric. One of my business partners, Jen, was primarily the person who facilitated that. We, for lack of a better term, she provided a physiological substrate for cognitive behavioral therapy with veterans struggling with PTSD. So we're looking at PTSD and saying, hey, this is a physiological process, kind of as much or it kind of precurses the higher thought process, maybe issue that post-traumatic stress can provide. So she was doing things like breathing practices and stuff like that back before it was cool. So
Yeah, sounds like now current stuff. So pretty ahead of their
totally.
time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really taken off in the corporate sector in particular. But, we did work. So she particularly did work with the Bengals and the Browns, kind of same deal. And I was primarily working with, dudes that had been like, blown up, just infantry dudes, grunts that, weren't getting the help that they needed from, the VA system alone. So we were really kind of a big community for veterans. I was always really kind of called to that community, having a lot of friends and that were, that were in the service, particular in like the Marine Corps, and getting out and transitioning to that civilian life. But after a certain period of time, I was like, man, the small business life ain't for me. So got the opportunity to go work in contracting with the DoD, which was something I always wanted to do. Working with some of the soft guys back at Athletes Performance, man, they were just squared away, high performers, really dialed in. I just kind of wanted to be around that community. And so got an opportunity to do some contracting work with AFSOC, and then later would go on to work in the pilot community where I currently work with a contracting company that's awesome. I should say, I guess as a disclaimer, my opinions and thoughts are all mine, so obviously we're going to talk about some things that relate to like health and fitness on this. And but I think it's been awesome to work with a bunch of different communities, from your everyday person who's wanting to get in shape to a top athlete who's preparing to the NFL, to maybe an operator who's preparing to go downrange. I think it teaches you a lot about how different people perform in different environments and how to kind of tailor your process to everyone.
Yeah, well, that's great. That was a great background for the audience. Definitely kind of getting some background on you. Then let's just jump into some of these topics. And actually, I think the one question you had recommended earlier about your number one takeaway from working in the health and fitness industry for over a decade, just dive in with that, because I think that's a great prompt, and that'll kind of lead us into whatever we want to cover from there.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, I love I love getting the older I get, the more I like the 10,000-foot view of stuff. I think
Of
it's a
course.
great lead into other things. And it's just kind of a general philosophy statement to some degree. So I'd say it's hard to pin down a number one takeaway. But, in general, the way, at least my training philosophy or philosophy about human performance has evolved over time. And it's been influenced by working with just phenomenal people, phenomenal coaches and phenomenal, end users as well, is in, strength and conditioning and human performance, particularly in the training, modality of sorts, is oftentimes influenced by, athletics, lack of a better term. A lot of people, they, we're training NFL athletes or whoever, we're going to scale that model out to the general population. And oftentimes people as practitioners, we find our value in the art of the delivery, right? And so what that translates to oftentimes for the end user is you get coaches that are really good at programming and periodization. They make you into really great weightlifters. Or you have coaches that are really athletically inclined, right? And so they kind of train you like they would train their athlete population. When in reality, with the majority of people, we talk about health, wellness, and kind of that spectrum of how it translates to fitness and performance, is biological adaptation is ultimately the goal we're going for. And you don't need to do that through what we conceive to be conventional methods in current day. I think like, for example, one of the craziest things to me is seeing the average person working with a coach or a practitioner who's just, we're focused on like, hey, like we're gonna get them spun up on how to lift weights, basically. And that's the value I bring as a practitioner to this person, versus kind of getting back to the basics of doing a needs analysis and getting after the biological needs of the person. So a lot of people in general just need a lot of low intensity training and a slower progression to have a sustainable fitness program. And it doesn't have to be fancy. And in fact, I think that idea of minimal effective dose is pretty effective with most people. It doesn't take a lot to drive a good biological adaptation, or at least it doesn't take a lot in just like weightlifting or just, running sprints or something like that. We can really focus on, doing low intensity training to improve, cardiovascular health and mitochondrial density, and improve kind of the states of being that most people eat, live, sleep, and live most of their day in. And that for most people is going to expand their capacity for life and also their longer term capacity for training as well. We only really get better at some of these things like training for performance really within a certain time window on our lives. But for example, like endurance athletes, they oftentimes peak when they're in their freaking 40s, and so it's just kind of understanding, the people that you're working with, and shooting more for biological adaptation is like, the top of the pyramid, the thing we're going for. How we get there, we can do it many different ways. And, I don't have to just push, pull, hinge, squat my way there, as a coach. One other piece of that, and I think it kind of plays into it, is that the fields of human performance in general, I kind of internally think of them as soft sciences. Like they're sciences that there's a guy named, I think his name's Dr. John Ioannidis, I believe, out of Stanford. I believe he is a professor. And I was reading a quote from him a long time ago that really resonated with me about how essentially he was saying something to the effect of 90% of studies that he was auditing, and maybe as a journal like PubMed, proved their hypothesis right in some way. And that's not the world. In fact, like, it's funny, you go to like a conference for human performance. I was just at one this past week. It was a great one. It was the Athlete Engineering Conference in Mississippi State. And, some of the things you hear from people that are out there doing things like sports science and collecting all this data on whatever population, baseball, whoever, is trying to kind of find a way to make that data actionable for their populations. And what that kind of shows is that the theoretical frameworks we oftentimes work off of in these fields don't always align with reality. And maybe there's a lot more going on, and maybe just a lot more or a lot less, who knows, going on. But, if you really start to dive into a lot of like, studies and things like dietetics, or I'll just pick on dietetics for a bit, because I can pick on any of the fields between strength conditioning, dietetics, or whatever. We're basing a lot of information off of things like self-report surveys. We're basing a lot of information off of things that have, or basing decisions, off of things that have confidence thresholds that if we were in like an engineering field, you wouldn't dream of doing, right? And so it's important, I think, for us as a community to outwardly have honest conversations with people. I don't think people like know this and don't say it. It's just like, you really need to dig into sometimes the information. We're getting kind of understand the limitations of the way we can research people, because we can't put, subjects into a sleep lab, have you all do the same exercise and track the impact of blueberries on your hypertrophy. You know what I mean? It's just, they're very complex fields. They tend to intertwine with each other. And, outside of sleep science, not a lot is stuff that you can always just take to the bank.
Yeah, well, that's really good. And honestly, kind of what you were touching on the end, it reminds me of when I went to India and I did a yoga course there, and I was a little bit struck by how little physiological instruction we received. So, and what I came away with that was, what I would tell people is, like, you need to be very skeptical of who you're listening to, because just because they have, in this case, maybe they're a certified yoga teacher, or in these cases, they might be, oh, I'm a certified strength and conditioning coach. And I mean, this could go all the way to, people with their doctorates,
Totally.
and this would, I would say, apply to life in general. Is like, you need to be very skeptical, because people are really incentivized to sell themselves. And I mean, in terms of a yoga example, it's like there will oftentimes be like the teacher will go around and make adjustments, and those adjustments aren't always necessarily correct. And I know my cousin, at least she's a yoga practitioner, and I think at one point she had gotten injured, not like a serious injury, but the instructor had given her an adjustment, like a physical adjustment that her body didn't like. And
Totally.
so I would tell people like, yes, absolutely. You need to be very careful who you're listening to. Definitely go out there and get the information. But I would place it in the same thing. Like yoga also, it's more of a soft science. I mean, everyone knows if you're doing meditation and breath work and stretching, kind of like, you know, these subsections of yoga, like that's good for you in the same way that lifting. Yeah. I mean, we know that it's good for you, but how you lift, how often you lift, even, you know, what time of day you're lifting, these are all factors that need to be taken into account. And I think at least the recommendation that I would say is it's like the N of one. You know, like
Yeah,
all these studies are being done on different people, but they're not you. And you might, who knows, like you might just be a freak. Maybe you can train 6 times, 6 days out of the week, and you feel fine. And if some studies out there saying like, oh, that's too much, well, I mean, you know, that may be too much for the average individual, but you know, maybe for you it works. Or on the other end, maybe if they're recommending 3 to 4 days, maybe your body doesn't like that so much. Maybe it's better to stick on the lower end. So yeah, I definitely feel you when you're talking about the human body and human performance. It's such a complex field. It's not mechanical engineering, you know, that's an aspect of it, but it's infinitely complex.
totally. And I really like the example you talk about there with like a yoga teacher and even, you know, kind of the idea of like the N of one, because when I was younger in my career, man, I thought the value I was bringing to the table when I was having a session was in how much I was guiding the person, right? Because I felt like I needed to do them a service constantly. So it's like kind of it's almost reassurance, really subconsciously for me that I was, you know, I wasn't being a turd by not, you know, doing something during the session. But you'll notice this a lot in older coaches and you know, worked really closely at one point in my career with some very experienced coaches that were, you know, doing things. People always like, man, you know, he doesn't say a lot, you know, he doesn't, and it's because like, really, we're just giving you stuff to do. And there's really no right or like, I hate when people say this is the right or the wrong way to do an exercise. Like, there's no real right or wrong way to do something. And most of the time, you know, you want the person just to go with what feels natural while they're doing something. You might make adjustments based off of leverage. You think you're going to give people a better opportunity to move more weight or you know, get them stronger. Work. What I think about kind of primarily is like a tissue area that I'm trying to develop, you know, or something of the sort. But you know, people have a tough time too, you know, kind of being comfortable with just watching the process of a person learning. And then additionally, on that side, you know, when you're a coach, you're constantly pulling from your own personal experience and kind of projecting that onto your client to some degree. I think that's where a lot of the things that make us unique as people and coaches, and a lot of the value we actually do provide to the person, you know, they typically resonate with the kind of way that you train, and you typically inform that by the way that you train, right? So
Mhm.
but it's really hard sometimes to remember like, oh man, I've been lifting weights for freaking 13 years, you know, or I like to feel this, that, or whatever. A lot of people like to train themselves to the point where they can't walk up the steps. Well, your average person doesn't want or need that, you know, and so sometimes is you need to think outside of your little, you know, scope of how I'm providing value. When I start thinking more in line with the person that you're coaching and working with. It's a tough thing for people to do.
Yeah, well, I think what you mentioned about the minimum effective dose and just kind of sustainability, because I mean, as I've gotten older, what I've kind of been struck by is how much really your innate ability is less important. Obviously, when you're starting to talk about the extreme population, so anyone that wants to be engaging in professional athletics. That's like the 0.01%. Yeah, of course, your innate physical ability, or let's say chess, for example, like your innate mental capacity is going to make a difference. But for the other 99%, what's way more important is really like that discipline and the sustained effort and maintaining that consistency. That's so much more important. And the minimum effective dose, I mean, that's something I would really want to highlight. Because for me, at least, I mean, I don't know how most of the population would fall into this, but I fall more into the pushing towards overtraining. And so I have to, if you're like a lazy piece of shit, okay, then maybe you do need to be like, yo, I need to push myself. But for me, I'm on the opposite end to where like I need to remind myself, hey, recovery is as important, if not maybe even more important than what you're actually doing, because otherwise, and this week is actually a good example. So I've been trying to get up at 5 and work out with my wife and then go to jujitsu, which is like a pretty intense, usually like hour and a half of training. And I could tell, so that was 4 days in a row of that this week. And then today on Friday, I woke up and I could feel like a little bit of a sore throat. And you just feel like, and even yesterday at jujitsu, I could tell I was just like, man, I really feel it this week more than I normally do. And so for me, focusing on that recovery is so important.
Oh yeah. If you're training an athlete for an event, you're constantly thinking of, I think of the really elite coaches out there thinking about how they can get them game ready without costing them the least to get them game ready. You know what I mean? And with the regular population, I feel like
Hey, I'm kind of losing you a bit, right? I'm getting like a 1 second. So technical difficulties there. I forget what we were on.
we're just talking about the difference. When someone goes game ready, you're trying not to cost them too much in that process because you want to perform over time, right? And sometimes with people in general, when they're thinking about their fitness plans and how to improve kind of themselves, you can just know you can almost always hammer yourself with low intensity work. Like you can always walk uphill on a treadmill and become an absolute beast at things that really assist you with everything in life, from living to sleeping and stuff. You can walk an hour or two uphill on a treadmill if you really feel that kind of urge to crush yourself with something at a minimal to moderate heart rate. But oftentimes what we do, especially is I think about myself kind of skewed towards strength and conditioning, is, man, I want to hit 5 sets of guns. I want to hit 10 sets of squats. And for a lot of people, that's not always the best answer, because you live a life on top of that, and you could probably be getting the same gains or even better gains by hitting a few sets to stimulate, and then hopping on a machine and hitting leg extensions and stuff like that for muscular development.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of getting to like that Pareto principle, 80-20 idea, to where, if you're not a professional athlete or someone aspiring to that, it's a very good chance that training like them is not going to be beneficial and might even be detrimental. I would make the argument. I mean, if you look at like CrossFit, for example, and that, I mean, I used to do CrossFit. I think it has benefits, and the community and around it, definitely has benefits. But I think a lot of those movements that it has the average person doing, it's totally unnecessary. Like, you don't need the 40-year-old mom of four to be doing overhead squats, or like heavy one rep max snatches. So I
Totally.
don't know
But
that.
on that same side, you may want them to gain a lot of like internal rotation of their hip, or work on like spinal health and strength, in positions like spinal flexion. And I'm quote one of my colleagues, Taylor Starch here. He's always talking about how, elite athletes are usually trying to squeeze the last 1 or 2% out of something, and we, when we train people like professional athletes, this is good context for people, is, we're oftentimes training you to squeeze like 1 to 2% out of something that doesn't really translate to anything you do in your life, when you could be getting 90% of gains in this unrealized area of fitness for you, because I mean, gosh, if you like lift, let's say you've been deadlifting for 20 years, how much more can you get out of deadlifting, for performance, or for, health, or for size, or anything? Probably hardly anything. How much more could you get out of your aerobic fitness, or training your joints to be better and stronger? You could probably get so much more by just making that stimulus more novel for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's see what else we have on the outline here. Yeah, let's move. And I'm just gonna. All right, a little technical difficulties round two, but we're working our way through it. So let me navigate to the outline here. Okay, cool. Yeah. So next, I'd like to get into some of your habits. Obviously, you don't have to go into all of them, but things like meditation, cold plunge or showers, stretching. What are some things you've been implementing, either have implemented or are currently doing, that you feel have made a difference?
Totally, man. Yeah, I've become such a simple person over the years. I like doing cold plunges. I know everybody's. I went to a great presentation one time. This guy, Paul DeTuro, friggin' exceptional person, and a cool story. I encourage anybody to check him out. But he was kicking off his presentation at the Southwest Research Institute Human Performance Conference last year, and he was basically said, like, how many, he asked, or show of hands in the room, like, how many of you guys like think cold tubs are bad? How many do you think are good? There's some, people were kind of like, like for good or bad, and
Which is right.
it's funny. It's funny because sometimes I joke around about this with some of my friends. People are like, "Oh my God, you're gonna shunt hypertrophy if you hop in the cold tub." Like, well, I'm like, well, for how long? They're basically saying like you're going to slow down the inflammation process to begin repair and regeneration. I'm like, I'm pretty sure your body's gonna, inflame just fine, even if you take 20 minutes in this cold tub here. It's people tend to get so into the week, and think about how, to me, it's just fantastic, mental training to have to stay in it. It's also, I mean, I find, I'm doing a lot of trail running. That's kind of another thing that I've really done, is a lot more, the guys that go into the pipeline, they're like, man, I can't wait to like get out and do weights and kind of like, train myself to be a little bit more, bigger and stronger. And for me, being a collegiate athlete, it's funny, you want to go the other way, because you get out and you're like, oh my God, I can't even run a mile and a half. And these guys can run like, a mile and a half and friggin', like sub 11 minutes. It's crazy. So there's this natural diversion. It's fun. I've since I live in Phoenix, I can really get to a lot of the outdoors in Arizona, which is incredible if I could just run there. But obviously it beats your legs up pretty good. So hopping in a cold tub, especially when you're trying to run in the Phoenix summer early morning, is just phenomenal. I can't, I don't know if there's a better thing for it. So yeah, I'm usually in the hot tub, or the sauna as well. Sauna for me, just I enjoy it. I think there's plenty of literature out there on dry sauna that demonstrates its effectiveness, and many different parts of human performance. It makes sense, right? Because it's just we call a hormetic stressor. You're challenging your body to overcome heat and to thermoregulate. I also have found that the most effective things for me are the simplest things. you spend all day working, you maybe have a high speed day, and you come home. I really look forward to getting to the house, and I'm one of those kind of guys that's got 10 different hobbies he's doing at one time. I do a lot of like woodworking in my spare time. I find that's a way for me to do something really singular and simple. It's something that I did with my dad growing up a little bit. Whenever he kind of forced me to help him at the time, and now I kind of I want to do it on my own because now I find it enjoyable. It's funny how that works, but
Yeah, it's so weird.
it's a great way to solve a simple problem and to work from start to finish on something. But I'm also one of those guys that'll get to working on it, and I'll work for 3.5 hours, and it'll be 10:30, and I got to wake up at 6, and then you have no excuse to be, sleep is just is such a central part of me being good at life or my job. And I notice it immediately if if I'm not sleeping well enough. So my routine that's most effective for me is to just be in bed. If I'm trying to go to sleep by 10:30, man, if I can get into bed at 9 o'clock, I'm just I'm such a better person. If I could that's the number one thing for me that has become part of my routine, and that, and just taking the stress out of the week. So things like meal prep, I know it's to some degree like the cliches, but they're just so effective and they work so well at freeing up your week and giving you more time back to enjoy it doing whatever you want to. So those are really the big habits for me. The big routines is hitting the sauna, hitting the cold tub, meal prepping, spending time doing something enjoyable that can get you out of like, I'm in busy, I'm in working mode, to something more singular that, is really a big stress reliever, but taking care of myself and making sure I'm accountable to my sleep schedule.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say, I mean, if someone were to ask me, like, just straight up, if you could give one, if you were to focus on one thing for overall performance, not just athletic, but like life, and I would say sleep. And that it's funny because I think most people would say, I mean, if they're really, I mean, some people would probably say like what you're doing in the gym, which I would place lower as priority, and with nutrition coming above that, and then above even that would be sleep. And out of all three of those, sleep is probably the thing that people are really dedicating the least amount of, I don't know what you would call it, discipline or mental effort to ensuring that they take care of it. Because I mean, going back to the importance of recovery, that is your recovery time. And as someone like, for me, I'm like more of a night owl. And so for me, my sleep schedule, I have to stick to it because otherwise I get out of whack so fast. So even during the weekend, I usually, and I pulled this basically from a tip from Andrew Huberman, and he's like, you shouldn't be varying your wake up time by more than an hour. And also, I
Yeah.
think you mentioned like your eating times. So it's kind of like, I mean, the human body, it loves routine. It wants to know what is coming at what time of the day. And so for me, I try not to wake up or go to bed time by more than an hour. And then the eating is a little bit harder, with socially, but I try to stick to the same times more or less on eating as well. But yeah, sleep is huge. Sleep is huge.
Totally. And I empathize with people. I'm one of those people that wishes there were 44 hours, or I mean, sorry, 28 hours in a day, to freaking get a little extra bit out of life, but
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes, man, it's nice for me living in Pacific time right now because all the sports games are done by the time I can go to bed. But
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's a really, you will have a marked difference in your mood and how fast your brain's firing off. And I swear, when I'm like, man, why am I such a moody little bitch? It's just,
Mm-hmm.
it always comes down to, well, your sleep has been pretty trash, and it's because you haven't prioritized sleep, or going to bed, trying to rush to bed to go to sleep versus just kind of going home and relaxing and being okay with just relaxing, you know?
Yes. Yep, exactly. I think we're in the same boat on that one. And actually, one of the thing I was just doing a little bit of research on it before we hopped on the call, was about like blue light, blue light or artificial light at night, because I
Yeah,
think all of us understand intuitively that for the overwhelming majority of human evolution, our circadian rhythm would have been completely dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, which would
sure.
mean that you're getting more sleep. And then, once, we discovered fire and started implementing that, probably started to change. And then obviously with electricity and modern artificial lighting, it's completely different. And then I would say even on top of that, now we have technology, blue light emitting technology that people are spending a ton of time on, and at night, and probably the worst, even though I'm also guilty of it, is in bed. Like literally that's probably the worst thing you can do, is be in bed with this like information light beaming device just like straight into the retina. Your brain is like, oh yeah, let's go. I'm downloading some information. This must be like noon. Your brain thinks it's like high noon on the Sahara Desert, like you're about to take down a wildebeest or something,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
actually you're about to go to bed. So I think for me, because I have trouble falling asleep, it's something that I have to prioritize, or I will my sleep schedule will be off, or I'll go to bed and I won't be able to fall asleep. And so I'll bring it back to around to what I was saying. What I was just reaching is red light, because I think it would be asking a lot to be like, okay, sun's down, I'm not going to use any light. You're going to be walking
Yeah,
around like your dark house.
totally.
But I think my plan now would be, let's just say 9 to 5 is my sleep schedule. 10 to 6 is better for me, but trying to do 9 to 5 lately. I would say an hour before bed to go to red light. I would really like to implement that. And also I think the benefits of that would be twofold. Is one, you're not getting that artificial light and that blue light. And then two, it would also mean no time on the phone or the computer, which I think would also help to start to lower down everything,
Totally.
the whole mood and everything. Because what my wife and I, we like to play Call of Duty on our phones. And so we'll be like playing Call of Duty on the phone. We're like, fuck yeah. Or like, fuck, we lost. And then it's like, all right, time for bed. And you're like, your adrenaline is pumping because you just
Yeah.
won or lost the game by like 2 points. So
Well,
yeah.
to your point, the worst thing you do, which is what I'm super guilty of. I never personally really struggled with the light thing. I know plenty of people do. I can't even stay awake if there's a television on in the room. If I'm laying down for bed. The thing for me that's the ultimate thing is ambient temperature. And this I think it's probably very different for people because like your TV, for example, or your computer screen or your phone screen, sometimes they're not like always like emitting a consistent light, right? It's like kind of like there's cycles that are going and your
Flickering.
brain's registering
Yeah.
those and you're not consciously but man, consuming interesting stuff before you go to bed, which is you want to do interesting stuff or watch interesting things, and then you're going to bed. It's the only time you can watch the stuff. So, it winds up kind of cueing you in. You're playing video games or, it's time to catch up with all the people that texted you throughout the day that you just totally forgot about. That's my problem right there. But that winds up becoming, humongous barriers. The small things like putting do not disturb on your phone. Oh my gosh. Like, you know, 10 years ago, I remember everybody was talking about it on like, the health and wellness podcast. I swear to God, it rings true today. If you can manage to have the discipline to do that, man, it just takes away the distractors. And for me, man, if I make that room cold in conjunction with it being dark, oh, I am out like a baby. It's unavoidable. My body tends to really respond to the cold well, which is fantastic in Arizona summers on your power bill. When
Oh
you're
yeah, I
trying
bet.
68 degrees or whatever to go to bed. But
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually I'm the same. I also like it cool, and that's one of the things about living in Colombia is air conditioning is not even it's just not really a thing. At least here in Medellin, because it's higher up in the mountains, so your range of temperatures is pretty temperate, but still, it's like if I'm going to bed and it's warm, I might have like a fan on or something. But yeah, if in an optimal world, long term would definitely be nice to have some AC and get it going. Obviously, I think to add a caveat to all of this for people listening is like, we're all living in our own lives and have different circumstances, and you're not going to be able to implement all this. I don't have a cold plunge. I don't have a sauna. Would I love to? Absolutely. And is that something I would be like working towards long term? Absolutely. But I think, just something to keep in mind is like we're all dealing in suboptimal, I wouldn't say all, most of us are dealing with suboptimal conditions and trying to make the best use of what we have. So, yeah, for sure. All right, Joe. Well, that's good. So we covered, some takeaways from the fitness and health industry, some of the habits. And I would also like to get into diet. So I remember, I think this is maybe one of the first times we had met, and you were talking about implementing the carnivore diet. And that's like one of the things I initially like really liked. I was like, oh, this guy is, he's
sure, yeah.
how do I say it's like we should all be experimenting and doing that N of one research. So like it's just like the elimination diet. People can say XYZ about nutrition or fitness, but it's really up to you to be implementing these different things and seeing what works best for you. So yeah, I really liked that. Was something that immediately struck me about you, of like, oh, this is definitely a guy who is doing these experiments and seeing what works best for him. So in terms of you, the N of one, Joe, what kind of diet do you usually stick to, or maybe are striving towards? Don't do it perfectly necessarily per se, or what are your general thoughts as someone who has some physiological experience?
Totally, absolutely. Diet is, and I love that way to put it because it's always an experiment. I'd love trying whatever dietary thing comes online because it's more about, to me, the experience of doing it, the discipline it takes. You're sticking to a plan, kind of like sticking to a training plan. And I'll tell you, it's super hard to do, especially like doing when I tried the carnivore diet, which, by the way, for me, I felt fantastic. I did kind of a we call like a snout to tail version of that. So I was, taking in collagen because of the glycine, the amino acid associated with connective tissue. I was also eating organ meats. I was putting in quite a bit of the higher fat meats and things that probably wouldn't have technically been carnivore, but like butter and dairy products. But I personally very responded to that very well. It was really interesting to see the kind of changes that I got with it. Like I was very regular. I pooped one time a day. At the same time, I probably went like 3 weeks without farting. It was just like a pretty like it's just such a
That's so interesting, because people
it
would
was
definitely think that as not being the case, and probably would think the reverse.
it
So
was it was incredible. It just for me highlighted for at least my digestive system how, because when I started adding back in foods that had fiber in them, how just fiber takes, it's obviously challenging to digest, so challenging that you can't digest quite a bit of it. So the impact on that was really interesting. Now I will caveat that and say that the kind of training that I was doing was, I didn't require a bunch of like carbohydrates, right? So I was like lifting weights. I played basketball with the guys occasionally, but I wasn't out like doing what I'm doing now, which would be like trail running for a couple hours, hitting like, a 13-mile run with like 3,000 feet of vertical gain, that would probably not do too hot for me, if I was doing that, in those kinds of arenas when you're trying to perform, you're trying to get in like carbohydrate formulas to help sustain your performance over time and things like that. But I think the biggest thing for me with food is that, kind of like I was alluding to earlier, like, everybody wants to say, oh, this is good or bad or whatever. Like, nothing's good or bad. It's just like a thing, and if you want to try and find out what kind of impact that has on you, there's no way of doing it other than trying it, right? So experimenting is the big thing. And what you'll find is that by experimenting, you'll see how powerful things like food are on your physiology, whether that's something as big as not eating or eating, like, going periods of time without eating. Another thing I did for, gosh, it was probably over a year, was I would fast at least 48 hours in a row, like, consecutively 2 days on a weekly basis. Oftentimes would hit 72 in that time frame, and probably the longest one I did in that time frame was a 5-day fast. And it was just remarkable to see, how much my behavior was tied to food. Like, knowing that you didn't need food, but just how food was an impulse, and it's an impulse because it's enjoyable. A lot of, we have a lot of neurotransmitters that are tied to, your next meal, or the reward of having food, and food is obviously a resource we need to survive. That, we probably don't need to. The thing is, I think with food is the biggest thing that I think I've learned by messing with stuff is that, we box our mentality in about food. We box our mentality in about training, and we create these parameters that aren't, they just don't exist in real life. They're great frameworks, and they wind up being very successful for people who like to have a well-rounded plate, like your vegetables and your protein and your starches and blah blah blah. But like, does that need to be the case? What if you just had a meal that was just a straight steak? What if later all you had was like, a salad, or just like some berries or something, like there's no reason to think that each meal has to contain something or doesn't have to. And that's kind of like, back to the performance model. Like when you're training an athlete to be ready for competition, you dial in everything you can because you're trying to control a lot of factors. Well, with life, isn't it better for us to be way more flexible and to just be able to not have to control a bunch of factors? Like, personally, I don't currently I don't have a plan per se, other than, I kind of eat when I feel like I want to, and I eat what I think is going to taste good, and but for me, like, I don't ever have a desire to like eat dessert, or these that, not that I wouldn't. It's just like I just don't have, and some of that I think comes from the sensitivity I built throughout the years to things like sugar, or corn syrup, or things like if I eat it, like I'll definitely know, and I don't feel that good, so I probably will just not do it. But I think that winds up for me kind of becoming this thing where I because I'm training a lot in endurance training, I just need to eat a little bit more than what I'm usually eating, and that's usually I like eating red meat. I think red meat always has done a lot for me. It's denser. It provides a little bit more nutrient for me, and maybe potatoes or rice or something, but I usually tend to include a vegetable in there as well. It's just pretty it winds up funny. It's funny because it winds up becoming like a pretty standard meal. But my enjoyment comes from the how can I cook it in a way that's going to be the most appetizing, so I'll go way out of control. Like if I'm going to prepare a steak, it's going to take me an hour and a half because I'm going to like sous vide it and just sear it to the right the nth degree. And I think that's over time. But because the cool thing about food is the community piece of it, where it's like, my friends and family, like we always convene over a good meal, and we always, it's never something that's time constrained. It's like something that like you can wind down, you can focus on making this thing this elaborate meal and just enjoy it. So I would encourage anybody though to like play around with diets. It's incredible to see how much how much of an impact just the stuff that you're ingesting has on your body in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of meat in general and of red meat specifically. Definitely. I mean, last night I just smashed a steak and then like had more steak this morning. But I think it's so funny because, or it's not funny, maybe it's like ironic and kind of fucked up, but for somehow there's been this general health push. I don't know if you want to call it like a conspiracy, or maybe it's just like the sugar industry. Obviously, it's a free market. They're going to push, sugar propaganda, if you want to call it, and say, oh, sugar's good for you. I think I was just seeing like one from the 70s, and it's like, oh, sugar's energy.
Yeah.
Or that the list goes endless, like the cigarette ones where it's like the most recommended cigarette by doctors, and it was like from the 60s or whatever.
Totally.
But
Well, what's funny about that is like, because you're 100% right, and I think it's pretty common knowledge to most people is that like sugar cane, like the industry originally was a humongous industry. It was a huge foreign interest of America. It drove a lot of political decisions, and it drove a lot of like the dietary, guidelines. It wasn't necessarily always all the time like putting sugar at the top, but it was definitely like, I don't want to say like it wasn't having an honest conversation about the impact of sugar on physiology, especially as people were putting more into food or were incentivized to do it because of the production level that they had with sugar. And it's always the thing with food and agriculture is like, in our country in particular, why is something like corn so, like, for lack of a better term, subsidized? Like if to be, and why is it so prevalent in the food in the center aisles, or things like soybean and soybean oil and stuff like that. It's just things that we know are usually the most genetically modified foods, and they're usually things that are the least healthful for us. Why are they commonly the things that are the most supported in our economies? I could see corn, like, the utility of ethanol or something like that being something that would drive a lot of the production of it. And I'm sure that's part of it, but it seems to make its way into our food supply. And we definitely know it's not great for us, and I think people are attuned to that. But I think the challenge for people is that they don't necessarily always know it. You have to really put in a lot of effort to look at. I mean, I just do it subconsciously. I'm sure you do the same. Like, I just know to go to the nutrition facts and see what's in the freaking thing, like that's just ingrained in me. But I don't think the standard person, I mean, you have to move around to find food that, doesn't contain bad stuff. And I think that's what the biggest health challenge we have right now is how many barriers there are to being healthy, as opposed to saying, oh, people are lazy and blah, blah, blah. I mean, which very well may be the case. I think people are overworked and there's so many barriers to being healthy that we don't have a culture that's conducive to it.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I know something that has struck me is really how it gets like snuck into stuff. Because take something for like mayonnaise, for example. They're like, oh, mayonnaise, that's like egg whites and oil, but then you look on the back of it and the first ingredient is vegetable oil, which I mean, I don't know for the listeners, but like vegetable oil, essentially that is like industrial waste that they, I think sometime in the 20th century, some entrepreneurs managed to find a way to take this waste and turn it into, I'll call it edible, like you can eat it, but it's not really something that, let's say, like our ancestors would have been consuming, or sugar as well. It's like, okay, maybe they would have been consuming small amounts of sugar in the form of fructose and fruits, or like who knows, like small amounts. But you go and get like some barbecue sauce and you're like, oh, it's barbecue sauce, what's in this? And you look back and if you use like a couple tablespoons of barbecue sauce, you're consuming as much sugar as like half a candy bar. And so I think what people get into trouble is they use their mayonnaise and barbecue sauce and who knows what else that has sugar in it, not realizing it. And then at the end, they're like, okay, I had a decent meal. I'm going to have a little dessert, with this as well. And it's like, well, that's the thing, is like, if you just had that reasonable portion of dessert, you probably would be fine. But it's since you're, maybe having a couple beers and some sauce that has sugar in it and something else, you have a soda, and this is all these things that people may or may not be aware of that have sugar. And then it turns out like, oh yeah, you just consumed like 40 grams of sugar. And it's like, well, really? How did I do that? And it's like, well, in this thing and this thing and this thing, there's sugar, and this thing and this thing and this thing, there's vegetable oil. Because it's like, I'll be honest, I will, consume sugar or mayonnaise, but if you don't even, the danger is when you don't even realize that you're consuming it. That's the issue. Because then you're like, oh, I'm going to have dessert because I had a good meal. It's like, no, actually what you just had actually already had a bunch of in it too. So
yeah, and it's tough too, because I think I'm certainly not a subject matter expert in this area, but I believe that it's probably very challenging to have an honest conversation about food and its impact on people when there's no incentive to have really objective research on things like hydrogenated oils or stuff like that. I know there is research out there, and it tends to be conflicting. Things like sugar, right? Because you have paid by the industry studies, you maybe have third parties and universities, but even there, regulatory agencies and these people obviously are impacted by where their funding comes from and where the big lobbies are as well. So it's really tough to know the entirety of the impact. But kind of to your point, and I think a lens that people, particularly in our communities, just because when you hear something that's been around for a while, it becomes a cliche. When they talk about like ancestral diets and whatnot, I think that still it's a logical lens to view things out of, because we are, it's remarkable that people don't, look at it like that, because your whole entire biology is dictated from billions of years of evolution of things that from down to the cellular level. I mean, you start introducing complexity into that, it's natural to assume that there's probably going to be some reaction to it, and we to reference my friend Taylor again, we'll go hit a run and freaking be down in maybe 100 grams of carbs in an hour because of how much output we have and how long the run's going to be. And even then you're like, dang, you're taking it in. And as you're tasting, you're like, damn, I'm eating a lot. I'm ingesting a lot of carb. And then we'll go to the gas station afterwards trying to re-up on carbs. And you'll see someone checking out with sodas and things like that and be like, that person right there is about to consume the same amount of carbohydrates I just consumed, but I just did a 2,000 to 3,000 calorie effort, out there running. So, like those, to your point, like people sneak it in, it's just part of people's lifestyle. I drink a Coke, I drink whatever, like it's good. It's, it's wired into me to want it, to do it. And the impact of it, man, I mean, you just need to look around to see the impact of it. It's a very unfortunate thing, and for us as a society, I just don't know how we're going to sustain. I know people talk about it all the time, but with our healthcare system, I feel like the only way that we can have sustainable healthcare is if we, as a society, as a culture, start to value things as fundamental to our existence as the things that we put into ourselves, or the things we surround the environment with, from a crop standpoint, from the way that we raise agriculture. And I think you get a lot of propaganda in that world as well. I mean, it's always talk about it. It's funny how people are not to get political or anything, people are very oftentimes concerned with things like, climate change and whatnot, but they're not as concerned about being surrounded by genetically modified organisms. And that's just illogical to me. That's obviously probably going to impact and no one's studying what that's going to look like because there's no incentive to,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the idea of like, we talk about these fundamental things, but I mean, who's benefiting by putting out, like, how can you profit off of letting people know that sleep is so important,
Sure.
or,
Yeah.
and like the market for that is minimal. Whereas the market for trying to partially cure someone of something so that they have to keep coming back, well, that's a multi-billion-dollar market. So preventive health, an ounce of what is it? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It gets at
Totally.
that. It's like, and I would say the market correspondingly indicates that, an ounce of preventative market, is probably, it's a fraction of the healthcare market for people that are, diabetes, for example, insulin. So it's like, okay, you have diabetes. Now you have to buy insulin for the rest of your life. Well, oh shit, like
Yeah.
subscription business model right there. As an entrepreneur, that's all I hear.
Well, my number one recommendation to clients previously, I'd work in the private sector, was always just like, hey, you want to really challenge yourself, from a dietetic standpoint, to be healthy too. It's something that's a win-win for everybody. It's a win for your local economy. It's a win for you because you're eating healthy and you're eating, things where you're meeting the person from the sources. Challenge yourselves to buy as much of your groceries as possible from your local farmers market. And you would be shocked at the difference of the food that you're going to acquire there, as opposed to something that is from an international chain of providing, like agriculture. So, if you go to your local farmers market, what's the difference between that piece of meat that you're going to get or the vegetable? Man, you can't hardly eat the stuff and not feel differently about it. The flavor is so much different and whatnot, but it's really, to me, about getting back to the fundamentals of our societies and our communities, and how we create values around health and beyond health, about kind of our local people that we interact with the most. Is just getting out and supporting your local farmers market. And I'll tell you, I've developed connections to these things. Eventually, what happens is you buy so much from them, they throw in something new, and you try something new, and it's just a fantastic community to get active with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I have definitely not prioritized and would like to. It's pretty interesting also, even because living here in Colombia, that whole like big ag, it just doesn't really exist. And so even if I go to the supermarket and get some eggs, and then like I was back in the States for a couple of weeks a little bit ago, and like I cracked an egg and I'm like, this is like yellow. Like, I'm like, this looks like a movie egg, or this looks fake. And then I'll
Yeah.
come back here and it's like, this is an egg, So I don't know how far. And, I mean, as someone who is an advocate of like, the free market and capitalism, I
Yeah.
get that at the end of the day, every company is going to try to produce as much as possible for as little as possible,
Mhm.
and that might mean sacrificing on quality. And so really at the end of the day, like the free market is just responding to the demands of the consumer. So
Totally.
I think it just goes back to your point. It's on us as the consumers, the one who are creating that demand to go and buy from sources that we believe in and want to support. I mean, that goes down to any business. It's like the people that are like, oh, like fuck Nike, I'm gonna buy Converse, but Converse is owned by Nike. It's
Yeah.
it's like I think you're missing the mark there. There's a bigger picture. Um,
Totally.
but yeah, all right, dude. Well, we definitely hashed it out. Um, I did want to ask you if you've been getting much into any MMA or jiu-jitsu lately. I know you used to get after it a bit, but what about these days?
Yeah, man. It's funny. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't been as much. And the challenge is for me, uh, it's always a challenge for me, like martial arts. I got to find the right instructor, and I've my background is primarily in broadly Japanese martial arts, but primarily karate, as I would say, which is why I love the name. The Bushido Podcast is fantastic, and it's funny because I'm back home in Cincinnati right now to attend a black belt test, and I got started in martial arts. With a guy named Dave Magliano. He's got a place called the Tatsu Dojo. It's just out of his garage. His whole goal was he's the Air Force veteran. He's like, hey, I want to have a community where people like to train hard and we're not bound to, the overhead of a business, so that if this ain't a good fit for you, I'm not changing up my class for you. Instead, I'm going to attract the kind of people that want to train the way that we train. And so he was a very inspirational guy. He's a phenomenal instructor. I feel like I learned quite a bit from all the way from Japanese jiu-jitsu to karate concepts. And there's kind of that little bit of, you move on from we're training in a place for 7, 8 years to go into a new school and trying to find that fit. And it's been a challenge for me. I trained with a couple people in Phoenix. I trained with the guy who's just a long distance away from my home. He was doing Jeet Kune Do and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So, I mean, he's a badass dude, man. He is a really good instructor as well. It just was really challenging for me to leave work, drive 45 minutes here, and then drive 30 minutes home, and just wasn't getting in there enough. And I'm traveling a little bit for work, so it wasn't really a feasible fit. And then I started training with a guy who he did more Okinawan karate. So differences basically in karate are, most people think of karate as, hey man, that's bullshit, and they're right. Like if you're like the Karate Federation, like you're doing katas in a line, and that's like how we're promoting you with all these rank structures. Like, man, the chances of you coming across the actual place that's going to teach you functional skills is very, very limited. And so because of that, it's really hard to find a home. But, this guy was, I thought, a solid instructor. And, Okinawan karate is tighter stances, and you do kind of like the footwork and the stances are different. He in particular was working on a stance, did a lot out of a stance called Naihanchi, which sets itself up a lot for like throws and low sweeps and kicks. But he unfortunately moved away. So because of that, I'm kind of searching for my home. But I still spar with some guys on, like probably about once a week, and I try to roll as much as possible. I hit the bag all the time and train on my own, in my backyard until I kind of find that home. But I wish, once you start a martial arts practices, man, and you find that groove with it and the right setting, it is something that just takes over your life. And it's such a positive practice, so that when you don't have it, it's like, I kind of view that almost as also the challenge to some degree, to have the discipline to keep practicing, to continue kind of honing things in, because martial arts really is about it's about you, it's about you honing in on yourself and trying to improve yourself. And it's great to have other people there. Obviously it's better training, but sometimes you gotta, stop being in that student mindset and start being in that kind of like real world mindset of how can I take care of myself even when I don't have the resources.
Mm-hmm. So you said you're back home to take a black belt test?
So I have my my Shodan, so my first degree black belt through Dave Magliano through the Tatsu Dojo. And so it's it's one of those things that when it's very rare to have a test in general. Basically the way that he does it is there's a brown belt and a black belt, right? And traditionally the black belt just means like, hey, now you're ready to learn. It's like you graduated high school, So it's like, it's we put a lot of weight in it because it's a very it shows that you've been dedicated for a long time. I think in general, most people, aren't able to stay with it for that long. But in the Japanese system originally, I was part of like the schooling system. So, reaching your Shodan was like, all right, now you're ready to kind of go out and apply and test yourself, the basics, right? And so the last member of kind of the core group when I was still living in Cincinnati is testing out, and she's to my knowledge, is the first woman to go for it. And so came back, whatever that we have one, we try to make it back and try to get the whole nucleus back together for the test. And it's a fun one, man. I think when I had my black belt test, it was almost 5 hours long, and it was like, the first 2 hours just try to smoke you out. And then, from there, we're going to apply technique. And then the end is just, we were trying to make you quit and see if you will, so.
So interesting. And what is the belt system for karate?
That's a great question. Because I never started in a traditional school, I'm not familiar with the ranking structure, other than I know like it progresses from like yellow belt probably to, so it starts at yellow, I believe, depending on where you're at. And I think there's like kind of the purple, blue kind of progression as well. But I will say this, like, one thing that impresses me about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the level of standardization that exists that is freaking legit. Like if you're rolling with like a purple belt, even, from someone from my perspective, I'm like, man, this person's probably pretty solid, because it's become such a popular sport, and for good reason. It's freaking awesome. But for anybody that hasn't rolled, it's like, dude, you got to get into it and try it. Or at least try a martial art, because I think things like Muay Thai are very similar, where people train hard in those communities. And I love that. I wish that more karate communities would actually train hard, and throw each other and hit each other and do the things that, people traditionally did. But, because I grew up in a system that kind of, we didn't even call ourselves a karate school. It's really like just kind of a Japanese martial arts school. There was just 2 belts that I knew. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I don't know I don't think it was the UFC, but I think it was some sort of martial arts competition that happened. This was maybe, I don't know, maybe like in the 70s or something, between, maybe like karate, whatever else. You would probably know more of those than I would. And karate actually came out of maybe 5 fights that the karate guys won like 3 of 5. And so if you go back to like true karate, it's actually a very effective martial art. And I think, to your point, like you said, it's just that it became sort of like industrialized or like marketized to where it was almost like a victim of its own success, where people are like, oh yeah, I'll just open up a karate dojo and, have people do some moves and that's that. But if you go back to like the core of the art, or I think like Wonder Boy, Wonder Boy, he's like has a karate background, and you see that in his style in the fights in the UFC, and used it very effectively. I think when he fought Masvidal, he just like picked him apart with his karate.
I was going to say George St. Pierre's karate guy, Lyoto Machida. I mean, there's a lot of people that are really effective tacticians. And what's cool about karate, I'm certainly not an expert, but comparatively to other martial arts, one of the things that karate really stresses, at least the way that I learned a lot in my training, was things like stance and push kicks, things that were a little bit more unconventional in forms like Muay Thai. I feel like it's just like, man, it's a freaking bruiser's game. Those guys are always, it's tough to spar with Muay Thai guys, because they just, man, they'll just eat and keep going and keep going and keep going, But it's funny when I was training with a lot of guys, like, even some of the guys that we mutually know that do martial arts, is they're like, oh man, Joe's got a traditional background. And, from my perspective, I'm like, man, I'm one of the most non-traditional karate guys that there is. There's just like, we never did katas. Like we had like 3 of them that we did, and we kind of did, like they were important, but Dave would kill me for saying this, but it certainly wasn't a core of what we did whatsoever. A lot of what we did was hitting stuff, and taking the time of like, like challenging, is this thing gonna work or not, in this scenario. So those are the more fundamental things that I think are probably existent. And there's not a whole lot of difference between most striking arts in general. I think traditional karate, one of the things you might be preparing for, if you take like point system fighting out of it, you're oftentimes preparing for very close quarters combat. And there's a lot of throws in karate. I think that's another thing that people aren't as aware of. So, the style of combat changes a lot when you're spread out and kind of facing somebody, one-on-one or whatever. But, if you're looking at like combat arts that are built for close quarter combat, that fight's going to be really close. Obviously, weapons back in the day were involved. So a lot of karate is built off of that specifically.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's super interesting. I mean, it's definitely obviously I wrestled in high school and then picked up jiu-jitsu just a few years ago. And then I would say probably within the last year or so is when I started getting really serious and going to a gym here in Medellin, which I really like. It's a really great community, pretty small. It's pretty interesting because the room we train in, I don't know, maybe like 20 to 25 feet by like 15 feet. So it's cool because it ends up that you just keep against the wall, you keep going, so that adds like a whole different aspect, which I like because, for me at the end of the day, even though I do compete in jiu-jitsu, at the end of the day, it's really something to serve as like a self-defense tool if it really came down to it. So, it's like, guess what? Walls exist also in real life. And, it could be quite easily that you get pushed up against the wall and you need to know how to, or maybe even like, I like to fight against the wall. And so there'll be times where maybe if I know a guy, maybe another wrestler, for example, and they like to be more using space and takedowns, like if you get them up against the wall, they don't necessarily know what to do. So it's interesting to hear that karate also has its own design that is not necessarily in a cage, for example, like UFC, but maybe like a more close quarters, and it does change things. It changes the things you do, the things you can do, or what's advisable and what's not. I know. So I just started training Muay Thai sometimes like once a week, and it's so different because so much of jiu-jitsu and wrestling, it's always about like staying low, staying like tight. You don't want to, open yourself up for takedowns. But then I go to Muay Thai and they're like, no, you need to like stand up, like get up, like you're going to catch a knee to the face or you're going to get like an uppercut. So that has been something I'm trying to work through when I go to Muay Thai, because I spend so much of my time, like crouching or like having a low base so you don't get thrown. And then I go to Muay Thai and they're like, hey, stand up, you're gonna get kicked or you're gonna get kneed. So that's a hard thing to take into account. But I mean, in a perfect world, if I just could do whatever I want, I would probably be like training all different martial arts. It's such a fascinating world. I mean, just in the grappling world, you've got wrestling, you've got jiu-jitsu, I mean, judo, throw in there. And then on the striking end, you've got, Muay Thai, boxing, karate. And then you have like this crossover where karate has throws. And then Muay Thai is almost like has some of those Greco-Roman type throws. So super interesting.
It is, I think what's so rewarding about martial arts is it's a way to learn. It's kinesthetic learning on steroids. So if you're a person that really likes to learn moving around, and a lot of people like they're dancers or whatever, like if you're an athlete or you want to really enhance your capability just to be more athletic in general, man, martial arts changes everything. It really does. It's a fantastic thing to do.
Well, what I like about jiu-jitsu is it's like, you see so many guys at the gym who are really strong, but they're only strong in a very limited, I want not ranges in range of motion, but their movement spectrum is pretty limited. Whereas like what I really like with jiu-jitsu is I have to be strong from in the full range of motion. Like I need to be able to push from here, with like the arm fully compressed, or you might need to pull with your arm fully extended. Or being able to, like the other day, some guy was trying to put me in like an arm triangle. And I tried to do like a 30-minute stretching routine every day, which I stick to pretty religiously. Specifically, jiu-jitsu has motivated me to do that because one, for injury prevention, but also just the game you can play if you're flexible new moves open up, or, like this guy had me in an arm triangle and I could, because of my shoulder flexibility, it's like, I'm good. I can be here. And then ended up was able to escape. But I feel like martial arts, just when you're in whatever sport or activity it is, when it's more functional, I think the how you develop yourself is so much more well-rounded than like, oh yeah, you can go in and maybe you can squat 315, but that doesn't mean that you could do anything like that amount. If you were in a similar scenario, like you might need to push to the side or like with one leg or anything. And so what I love about jiu-jitsu is you're constantly put in those scenarios of like, okay, I've got, my arms pinned, but I need to like escape out to the side. And the way it pushes you is just doesn't even compare to anything else. And I would never, I go in there and I'm at the end of that hour and a half, I'm soaked head to toe in sweat. And I would never be able to do that just on my own. Like if I'm not just going to get up and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to fucking crush myself today. Maybe that would be like a once a week thing, but I just wouldn't find the motivation. Whereas when I go in, it's more the opposite. I need to be like, if I'm not careful, I'll be going like too hard. So you take it from either wouldn't do it or would do it very rarely to, man, I'm going hard almost every day and getting to a threshold that I likely would not tap into otherwise.
Totally. Yeah. Going back to one of our original, points of the conversation is, you're a Brazilian jiu-jitsu athlete. I highly doubt that your bench press is something that is going to get you, keep you safe and functional down at the bottom. But like, hey, you might need to get really strong in external rotation. Well, what are we doing if we're training an athlete like that? Here we got to really prioritize that, just like a bench press. Right? We can enhance the strength of that just like anything. And to your point, your training should reflect what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, kind of like I really like that term. I wrote it down, what you said, the capacity for life. And I think, as us who aspire to be really functioning at probably the farther ends of the human performance as athletes, we're, definitely in the minority. And for the majority of people, they're really just what is it, like occupational therapy? It's kind of more along that. And they're just training to be able to, it might be like reaching over and picking their kid up and putting him into a car seat, or who knows, the options are a million and one.
Totally.
But
100%.
All right, man. Well, I think that's probably about an hour. And I feel like we really hashed out into some good stuff.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say this is perfect time because my phone is about to die.
Cool.
But I really think that it's a good conversation. Most people, again, like I think health and fitness and things like hobbies and stuff, man, they're all intertwined. And I think that there's a lot of resources out there for people to go with these things. I would encourage anybody who's listening to this conversation to just not think of health, fitness, hobbies, things like just don't think inside the box. Almost nothing is definitive out there. And most people think, okay, no, this is definitive, so that means that nothing is valid. Like, no, it's all valid. I think it really opens up a lot of opportunity. You could be someone who just, who loves Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you hit that all the time, man, that's freaking improving your health and fitness and your mindset, about life. And so I really appreciate the conversation. I feel like we always have good conversations, Levi. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Right on, man. Well, I couldn't say it any better than that. So I'll leave it at that. Let me just knock out the recording here.